Now is it turning the correct direction? No. It is flying the wrong direction and it's going to crash. I take back control. Oh, that worked really well. I was upside down when I triggered it that time. Oh boy. And boom. How about that? That worked real freaking good. Betaflight 4.5 brings a lot of bug fixes and feature improvements. And today we're going to look at one of the most exciting things Betaflight 4.5 did: fix and improve the GPS Rescue Return to Home function in Betaflight. It hasn't been very good. It's better now. But you got to set it up right. That's what we're doing. We're going to set it up and we're going to see how it works. I'm Joshua Bardwell and you're going to learn something today. And you might think that getting GPS Rescue working with Betaflight 4.5 is as simple as putting a GPS on the quadcopter, configuring the flight controller to recognize it, and then just you're good to go, right? But it's not. Because Betaflight is focused on acro performance. Betaflight is not focused first and foremost on autonomous flight. With Betaflight, there are some steps you need to take to configure GPS Rescue correctly, and if you don't do this, when you activate GPS Rescue, your quad could just fall out of the sky. Has that happened to you in the past? And the steps that we're going to be working through are on this page of the Betaflight website. It's linked in the video description below. And the first thing we need to do is configure the flight controller to recognize the GPS in the first place. I guess the first thing to do is to connect the GPS to the flight controller. But connecting the GPS to the flight controller is no different than any other UART-based peripheral. The GPS is going to have a TX and an RX wire coming off of it, and they're going to go to an RX and a TX wire. Don't forget to cross them over, TX to RX and RX to TX, on the flight controller. If the GPS has a built-in compass, it will also have an SDA and SCL wire, and those will go to the SDA and SCL pad on the flight controller. SDA and SCL do not cross over. SDA goes to SDA and SCL goes to SCL. Be aware that not all flight controllers are going to have an SDA and SCL pad, so if yours doesn't, you won't be able to use the compass on your GPS. But it turns out that's not actually as big a deal as you think. The compass data is often pretty noisy and often isn't that usable anyway, and Betaflight will work without it. Finally, you're going to need to power the GPS. Most GPSs will take either 5 volts or 3.3 volts, and if you have the chance to do it, you should power the GPS from a pad that gets power when you plug USB in. My quadcopter isn't actually set up that way. When I plug in USB, my GPS doesn't power up. And the problem with that is that the GPS then has to search for satellites while the video transmitter is blasting in its ear, and it makes it slower to get sat lock, and you lock fewer satellites. Ideally, you'll find a 5-volt pad on your flight controller that gets power from USB. Sometimes it'll be labeled 4V5. That's a dead giveaway. Or if you have a 3.3 volt pad, and if your GPS is rated to take 3.3 volts, you power it from the 3.3 volt pad, which always gets power from USB. Once you have the GPS wired to the flight controller, the next thing we're going to do is go into the Ports tab, and on the Peripherals column, we're going to set GPS for whichever UART number we soldered or plugged the GPS into. We're going to leave baud at auto. And then in Betaflight 4.5, the GPS settings have moved from the configuration tab to, oh my god, the GPS tab. What a strange place to put them. Kind of like that's where they should have been in the first place. And the settings we're going to choose are U-blocks. Betaflight 4.5 has extremely limited, actually they may have removed it entirely. They may have removed support for NMEA GPSs, I'm not sure about that. But you're going to want to use U-blocks, and basically all modern GPSs support U-blocks. And you're going to set auto baud and auto config. And most of the time this means that the GPS will start working. You're going to know it starts working when you see a yellow or red GPS icon at the top of the Betaflight configurator. Yellow means that you have GPS lock. Red means that the GPS is talking to the flight controller, but you don't have GPS lock yet, probably because you're indoors. Now, when you look at my quadcopter's configuration, you're going to notice that the baud rate has been manually set to 115200. If you know what baud rate your GPS is set to use, you can manually set it. And if auto baud doesn't work, and sometimes it doesn't work, you can try manually setting baud rates between about 9600 and 115200 baud. But hopefully most of the time auto baud will work and you won't have to go through that nonsense. You're going to notice in my configuration that I have the Use Galileo option enabled as well. Galileo is a technology that can improve the positioning, and I don't see any reason to have it turned off. Maybe somebody out there who knows more about GPS assisted flight than me knows why it's off by default. I always turn it on. And there's also ground assistance type, which is another technology that under some conditions will improve your positional accuracy, and I always turn it on as well because I figure why not give myself all the help I can get. Finally, you're going to need to set the Set Home Point Once option, and you're going to want to give some thought to this. You see, the way that Betaflight works by default is the Set Home Point Once option is off. What that means is that every time you disarm and rearm your quadcopter, a new home point will be set. And every time you GPS rescue, you will return to the last place that you armed the quadcopter. Can you see a problem with this? If for some reason you were to disarm your quadcopter and rearm it somewhere that wasn't a valid home point, the quad would try to fly to that location and it would literally never fly home again. If you're sure that you will always want the quadcopter to return to the last place it armed, then you should leave this option off. But some people would prefer to do Set Home Point Once. And what that means is the very first time you arm, that's the home point and will be the home point until you power cycle the quad. If you do this option though, make sure that at the time you set the home point, you have a good number of sats locked and everything is like, you have good positioning accuracy, because if you have bad positioning accuracy, then your home point won't be as precise. Okay, so now you've got a working GPS. You've got a red or yellow icon at the top of the Betaflight configurator, and you are ready to begin actually configuring it to work correctly. And according to the website, the first thing we need to do is make sure that our auto level is flat. When you go into GPS rescue mode, the very first thing Betaflight does is try to auto level the quad as if you had put it into angle mode. And if the accelerometer is not calibrated correctly, it'll be cocked off to one side, and GPS rescue, well, eventually, presumably, GPS positioning will detect that you're drifting and try to correct for it, but it's better if you start from a solid foundation of a flat and level auto level. So we're going to go into the setup tab and we're going to put the quadcopter flat and level on the table, and we're going to click calibrate. And then I'm going to plug my quadcopter in, I'm going to arm it, and I'm going to do a test hover. But the way my quadcopter is set up is it will not arm until it gets a GPS lock. So if you try to arm and yours won't arm, that's probably why. That's an option we can change later if we decide to, and I'll show you where later in the video. So I'm going to take off, and I'm going to switch to angle mode, and we're in angle mode, yes. How am I doing? Well, a little drift, a little bit of drift. Now, angle mode is always going to have a little bit of drift. There's no such thing as a perfect hover in angle mode. That's because the CG of the quadcopter is not perfectly centered, and there's always going to be a little bit of wind and so forth. So if there's a tiny amount of drift, don't stress yourself out trying to fix it. But as long as it's mostly hovering flat and level, you're good to go on to the next step. And the next step is figuring out what your hover throttle position is. And it's going to be easy. We're just going to hover it and we're going to look at our hover throttle position. But be aware, like the battery that you've got on there, if you've got a GoPro or if you don't have a GoPro, all of that is going to affect your hover throttle position. So you're going to want to think about it. Because if the quad is super heavy and you use that hover throttle position, then later if you GPS rescue and the quad is lighter, like you're running without your camera, then it's going to tend to climb. Or if the quad is super light, like you do a test flight with no camera and a tiny battery, then your hover position is going to be too low, and when you go into GPS rescue, the quad is going to tend to descend. Again, it just needs to be in the ballpark of correct, because once the GPS system kicks in, it's going to detect your altitude and your position, and it's going to adjust for that. But we want it to be pretty much in the ballpark of correct, so set your quadcopter up pretty close to the flying weight that you're going to expect it to be in when you activate GPS rescue. Now I've got, if you look in the lower right-hand corner of the screen, I've got my throttle position there. It's just above the on-min timer. It's currently at 0. And what I'm going to do is very simply take off and try to find an approximate hover where I'm neither climbing nor descending. And it looks like I'm hovering at about 23% throttle. The next step is that we need to set the stage 1 failsafe throttle value to this hover value. And the reason we need to do this is that when we first failsafe, GPS rescue won't kick in immediately. There is a small window of time called Stage 1 Failsafe where Betaflight waits to see if the signal is going to come back. The idea is that if there's a very short interruption in your signal, we want you to just keep flying. We don't want the quadcopter to freak out and assume everything is gone to hell. So the default behavior for Betaflight is that when you go into Stage 1 Failsafe, the throttle goes too low. It goes all the way down. And the idea is that if you're not in control, we don't want the quadcopter to be like doing anything crazy. And if you get signal back before you crash, the throttle will come back up and you can keep flying. But that's a problem because, like, let's say we're flying out over the ocean and we want GPS Rescue to save us, and then we failsafe. And in that Stage 1 failsafe window, before GPS Rescue kicks in, quadcopter goes into the ocean. So we want the throttle to default to a value that will cause the quadcopter to slightly begin climbing before GPS Rescue kicks in. The next thing we need to do is set the GPS Rescue throttle value. And this is the throttle value that will apply once GPS Rescue kicks in. And you might think, well, why does it need to know that? Well, can't it just tell whether the quad is climbing or descending and adjust the throttle based on that? And the answer is yes, but again, it helps if it has a good starting point to work from, as opposed to having to kind of just continue. The GPS data is not update that frequently. It's like 10 times per second. And the barometer is kind of noisy, and it just helps if you have a really solid starting point for the throttle. We were at 22 or 23% hover. If we want to climb slightly, maybe we'll add like 5% to that. We'll test it. We'll see if that's a good value. So that would be 27%. The throttle goes from 1,000 to 2,000, so the math is actually not that hard. It's going to be 1,270 would be 27%, right? So 2,000 is 1,270. So for the GPS hover throttle, we're going to set it to the actual hover value, which was 1,230, and save and reboot. Now, the next thing I see on this website is that the recommended baud rate for the GPS is 57,600 kilobaud. And you may remember that I'm at 1152. The problem is that faster bit rates are more susceptible to corruption from electrical noise. So you want to use a baud rate that is fast enough for your GPS update frequency, but no faster. Betaflight will by default try to set your GPS to the fastest update rate that it supports. So if you're running 57,600, you should be good to go. That will get you a 10 hertz update rate, which is the recommended value. If you have an M10 GPS, they can actually do 20 hertz, and that would require 115-200 baud, but that's Betaflight, the webpage says, oh, untested, test carefully. So there may be reasons why you might not want to do that. If you do decide that you want to change the baud rate, you're going to need to download a tool called UCenter, which is a piece of software that adjusts the settings in your GPS. Actually, I'm not sure that's true, because Betaflight auto configures the GPS. I should be able to just change the baud rate and have it work, right? Okay, I gotta know. We're going to go to the Ports tab, and we're going to change the baud rate to like 57,600, and we're going to save and reboot. The other thing you need to know is that for Betaflight to automatically configure the GPS has to be powered up at the same time as the flight controller. So what I'm doing here, where the flight controller is on USB but the GPS is powered down, that's not going to work. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to unplug USB, and I'm going to plug in the battery. And then I'm going to plug in USB, and we're going to see if the GPS is talking to the flight controller at all. Holy cow, it is. Okay, so this is working as expected. That's amazing. You shouldn't need to download UCenter and manually change the settings of the GPS. Betaflight is just doing it for you, which is one of the beautiful new features of 4.5 that was having problems in 4.4. Amazing. Well, I guess we'll set it to 57,600 as the devs recommend, since I don't think this is an M10 GPS. I'm not actually sure. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Doesn't matter. They recommend 57,600. That's what we're going to do. At this point, we've done the minimum amount necessary to do a basic test of GPS Rescue. But we're not just going to take off and fly into the distance and trigger GPS Rescue. How are we going to trigger GPS Rescue? Oh yeah, we have to set up a GPS Rescue mode. Here in the Modes tab, we need to add a GPS Rescue mode, and we need to set up a switch to trigger that mode. If you're playing with GPS Rescue and Betaflight, I'm going to assume you know how to do that, and I'm going to resist the urge to assume everyone is a total rank beginner and show you how to set up an aux mode. If you do need a tutorial on how to set up an aux mode, I'll put a link in the video description to my beginner build series where I take you through a build of a 5-inch quadcopter complete from start to finish for total noobs. And obviously there's a section in there on how to set up aux modes. But we are not just going to fly into the distance and activate GPS Rescue. This is the next reason that GPS Rescue fails for some people. And again, I'm not trying to blame you. GPS Rescue has been legitimately janky in the past, and it could still fail even when you did everything right. But a lot of times people just didn't do the basic checks because they just didn't know. They just expected it to work, and then it all failed. And so we're going to do some basic checks. And those checks are, well, number one, ensure the firmware is built with GPS support. Yeah, Betaflight 4.5 introduced a new way of flashing the flight controllers where features could be left out to save space. Well, obviously, if you've gotten this far, you have GPS support, because otherwise the screens that I'm showing you would be blank or they wouldn't work for you. So good to go there. We're going to enable GPS and GPS Rescue. Yes, we did that in the GPS tab. We enabled it. Check in the configurator that the module gains satellites in position reliably. So I'll go ahead and plug the quadcopter in, and we'll go to the GPS tab and we'll see how many satellites we've got locked. And we have 9 sats locked already. Instantly, this is not the first time I've powered it up, but we're good to go there. Now at this point, we could fly out and test GPS Rescue and see how it works. And that will be okay as long as we are not using GPS Rescue for failsafe. We are only manually triggering it. But before we activate GPS Rescue, we're just going to do some sanity checks. Like, for example, does my direction home arrow point home? No, not even remotely. My home point should be right here. And it is pointing the absolute wrong way. Let's check that again. Hang on. Disarm. Okay, now if I arm, I've got a new home point. 0 meters to home. Direction home is irrelevant because I'm right on top of it. And if I fly away, that arrow should point behind me. And it totally doesn't. My direction home arrow is pointing the absolute opposite direction from the actual direction home. If I activate GPS Rescue now, bad things will happen. I have to fix this. Now, normally the reason that this would happen would be if there was a compass on my GPS and the compass orientation was incorrect. If the compass was, like, a compass has an orientation, it has to know which direction it's facing relative to the front of the quad. And in fact, if we look in the Betaflight configuration tab, there are magnetometer alignment settings there that can be used to set the mag alignment correctly. You don't see those on my screen because my magnetometer is disabled. In fact, I'm not even sure that this GPS has a magnetometer. So I'm actually a little confused right now because, like, it should know what direction I'm going. You see, the way that Betaflight knows what direction the quadcopter is facing when it's got a GPS, think about it. GPS gives position. It doesn't give direction. If I have a GPS receiver and I turn in a circle, nothing changes. So how does it know what direction we're facing and what direction home is? And the answer is that there's a parameter called GPS heading. Basically, when you start moving in a given direction, the GPS heading tells you what direction you're moving, and in lieu of a compass, Betaflight assumes that's also the direction you're facing, since most of the time you're flying straight forward. You should know that if you were to fly sideways or backwards, the direction home arrow would be completely whacked out, because that assumption is no longer correct. And if you stand in one place and rotate, direction home, it might, like, figure it out from the gyro, like it's not just relying on the direction home, but in general, for the direction home arrow to be accurate, you need to be flying in a straight line for a short distance, and you'll see that it comes around to the correct value. I think I'm going to bite the bullet and try and assume this is a display issue, not an issue with the actual aircraft, and fingers crossed, it doesn't just freak out. Oof. Fun. Well, great. Now I don't feel so confident, do I? So, I am going to put the quadcopter somewhere reasonably safe. So I'm going to go out here, and I'm going to put the quadcopter relatively close to the ground, so if it disarms, it doesn't damage itself. And it's well away from anything that it might crash into. And I'm going to activate GPS Rescue. Here we go. Okay, we're climbing. That's good. Now is it turning the correct direction? No. It is flying the wrong direction and it's going to crash. I take back control. Let's try one more time. I think, oh, I see the problem. It was returning to home at the highest altitude I flew at. Let's climb to an altitude that is safe to return home at. That's my mistake. That's user error. Let's try one more time, though. Close to the ground. And GPS rescue. Climbing to good. This is a safe altitude. And are we coming home? That's better. Oh, and the direction home arrow is sort of pointing the right way. Okay, I'm going to take control before it tries to auto land because this is a pretty tight environment. But it is coming home. I'm going to take control. That worked pretty well. So let's set a new auto landing point here in my... Oh, let's set the auto landing point out in that field. That's a great place to auto land. And I'm going to need to land and disarm and take off again. Will I succeed at that? Guess we're going to find... Oh, God, no. Okay, good. Okay, new home point set. Now we're going to come over here. Again, we're going to make sure we climb to an altitude that clears all the obstacles around us. We'll go down here. Again, a safe place where if it disarms, I'm not going to break anything. And I'm safe to punch out and climb. And GPS rescue. Climbing. Good. Not quite going straight. Where are you going, buddy? Good altitude. And we're heading home. Now the home arrow is pointing the right way. I don't understand what changed. And this is a big open field, so despite the fact that I can't see below me, I'm going to go ahead and let it descend and see what happens. It should auto land. Oh boy. And boom. How about that? That worked real freaking good. That worked real freaking good, dude. But we're not done yet. You see, so far we have only tested the ability to activate GPS Rescue manually. And what we really want is for GPS Rescue to kick in when we fail safe and save us from losing our drone. And that's what we're going to do next. But before we do that, could I remind you I have a Patreon? Patreon is a website where you can subscribe to me for as little as $2 a month or more if you feel like I've earned it. Just ask yourself, if I was heading to work on the subway and Bardwell was sitting there and instead of like playing a guitar and singing a song, he was giving out drone advice, how much would you throw in my hat? If that's $2 a month, if it's $5 a month, if it's $10 a month, whatever it is, head down to the link in the video description and sign up for my Patreon. It is the best way to support me. You get access to my Discord server, which is it's patrons only, and it's full of just the most friendly, helpful people who want to talk to you about FPV. There's a troubleshooting forum. There's a buy-sell trade forum. You don't have to go into sort of the meat market of Facebook Marketplace. Ugh. But mostly what I hope you get when you sign up to my Patreon is just the good feeling that you're supporting the work that I do here. I listen to and watch content from a lot of creators, and I only support very, very few of them because there are only a few of them that are up there, and I really feel like they've earned it. And if today's the day where you feel like I've earned it, the link's down below. I'd love to have you. And if I haven't earned it yet, that's cool. I'm going to keep making content. I'm going to keep just sitting out there playing my guitar and singing my song, and maybe the day will come that you decide you're going to support it. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go into the Betaflight Modes tab, and instead of GPS Rescue, we're going to add the Failsafe mode. And we're going to set that up exactly like GPS Rescue was. I'm just going to reuse that switch, but we're going to delete GPS Rescue. And what this is going to do is now when I flip that switch, it's going to simulate as if a failsafe had occurred. Some people like to do this by just turning their radios off or yanking the module out of the back of their radio. That's pretty risky because if anything goes wrong, like it takes you a while to turn the radio back on, right? By doing this failsafe aux mode, we can simulate a failsafe without actually like forcing a real failsafe. So we've got the failsafe aux mode set up on that switch, and you could set it up on a different switch if you wanted. You could have GPS on one switch and failsafe on another switch. I just kind of don't feel like doing that. One thing you need to know, though, is that the failsafe switch needs to be with no other aux modes on that aux channel. It needs to only be failsafe and nothing else. Then we're going to go to the failsafe tab, and we're going to set the failsafe switch action to trigger stage 2 failsafe, and we're going to set the failsafe behavior to land. The only parameter here we're going to need to change is the throttle value to use while landing, and we're going to want to set this to something that slowly descends. The idea here is that the quad will sort of automatically descend until, well, it's just going to disarm and crash, so we'll interrupt it before that happens. So we were at 23% hover. Let's set it to something like 20%, which is going to be 1200. So we're going to set that to 1200. And then this parameter, delay for turning off the motors during failsafe, let's set that to 10 seconds. In real life, you wouldn't want to set this to 10 seconds most likely because the quadcopter is out of control, it's fail-safed, and it's just sort of auto-leveling and drifting, and you wouldn't want to let it do that for 10 seconds because it might... The idea here is that the landing will kind of level it out, slow it down, descend a little bit, and then it'll disarm and do the normal fail-safe behavior. But since I'm going to be manually triggering fail-safe, we'll set it to 10 seconds and we'll take our chances. I want to be able to take it out of fail-safe before it just disarms and crashes itself. And what we want to do here is we just want to verify that failsafe initiates landing mode. This is actually how GPS Rescue starts working before the GPS behavior actually takes over. So I'm going to trigger failsafe now using that same GPS Rescue switch that I did. No, that is wrong. That is the wrong switch. I'm an idiot. Now, we'll try again. Yep, okay, working good. It initiated landing and started to descend. That is what we want. Now we go to the next step. And the second step is going to be to change this failsafe switch action to initiate stage 1. This is important because remember that during stage 1 failsafe, the quadcopter is going to be waiting for recovery of link. It's going to go to that throttle value that causes it to slowly climb, and after a short period of time, then it's going to trigger GPS Rescue to kick in. And now we need to make sure that that is going to work correctly. If that's set wrong, then there can be a sudden drop that causes the quad to crash, or that causes it to disarm, and GPS Rescue never gets a chance to kick in. You also should take a look at this parameter, period of time in stage 1 after signal loss. This is how long stage 1 is going to last before stage 2, GPS Rescue, ultimately kicks in. The default value is 400 milliseconds, and you could consider setting that shorter. You could consider setting it longer. If you set it shorter, be aware that brief interruptions in your signal, short micro failsafes, could theoretically trigger GPS Rescue when you don't want it to. We're going to leave it at the default of 0.4 for now. And what we should see here is that when I initiate the failsafe, the quad levels out and starts to climb for 400 milliseconds and then enters auto landing where it starts to descend. That climb may be imperceptibly short because 400 milliseconds isn't that long, but we definitely don't want to see it descend at all. So let's start some forward flight here and we'll trigger it. Here we go. Yep, it's in auto landing. That worked pretty well. It didn't really drop. I'll tell you what, let's test it a little more aggressively. Like, what if I'm moving a little more aggressively when it triggers? Here we're risking a crash, but we got to do what we got to do. That worked pretty well. Oh, that worked really well. I was upside down when I triggered it that time. I was in the middle of a roll when I triggered it that time. That's working really freaking well. I'm kind of impressed. There's only one more step, and that's to trigger actual GPS Rescue on failsafe. We're going to do that here in the failsafe tab. We're going to change the failsafe behavior to GPS Rescue. Definitely take a look at this altitude value because you're going to want to set this based on the flight profile that you expect. The default is that the quad will ascend to the maximum altitude it was at any time in the flight, with the idea being that that will cause it to fly over any obstacles that are between it and the home position. This may or may not be the right thing to do, though. For example, if you knew that you were flying like underneath an obstacle, you might prefer that the quad returns home at its current altitude. Or if you knew you were going to be flying somewhere with just no obstacles out in the middle of the desert, there's no point in ascending to some high altitude and flying home when you could just fly home. There's also an option to have it return at a fixed altitude if you know for a fact there is a specific altitude you want it to fly back at. Think about this, because nothing sucks worse than GPS rescue initiating and the quad flying straight into the side of a building or something like that. Okay, so we've set GPS rescue as the fail-safe behavior. We're going to save and reboot. And at this point, we'll go ahead and test it, but honestly, I think it's going to be pretty drama-free. We've tested each of the parts individually to confirm that they're working. Now they should work when they come all together. But there's only one way to be sure. Don't forget to hit save and reboot on that, because then you'll take off and expect GPS rescue to work, and it won't work like I totally didn't just do. So let's not get ahead of ourselves, though. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to make sure that we had satellites when we took off. We had 13, 14 sats when we took off. We have a good, solid home location. That's a terrible home location. It's my porch. Okay, well, I'll take over before we crash into my house. Yeah. We're going to make sure our direction home arrow is pointing roughly in the correct direction. But in order to do that, we're going to fly straight. We're going to fly straight forward for a little bit to let it sort of sort itself out, because I don't have a compass. Okay, and then I'm going to position my quad somewhere where I would be okay if it crashed, but it probably isn't, because I've done all my checks, and we're going to activate GPS rescue or failsafe. We're climbing. That's good. Rescue in the upper left, I see rescue is active. We're turning towards home. We are flying in the direction of home. And we are flying in the direction of home. I will take over before it descends. There we go. That's the beginning of the descent phase. And it is roughly over where it wanted to be. Not freaking bad. Ah, I'm flying. I'm having a good time. Oh no, I fail-safed. Woo. Well, that is the end of the flight testing for this phase of the video, but there are still a couple more things you need to know. Give me 1 second. There's a setting in Betaflight that gives you a much better indicator of the health of your GPS lock than the number of sats locked, which is what we've been using so far. And it's called HDOP. And I don't 100% know what HDOP is beyond that it's a measure of the health of your GPS lock, but you can get Betaflight to show it to you in the OSD. And you should totally do that. I would have done it earlier in the video, except I forgot how to set it up and didn't look it up again until just now. Here's how you do it. What you're going to do is go to the CLI tab, and if we just type get HDOP, this parameter is that one. If I type set OSD GPS underscore sats show HDOP, I'll just hit the tab key to autocomplete, set equals on, and save. So you can see right next to the num-sats, there is the HDOP value. It's currently 1.6. An HDOP value around 1.0 or less is supposed to indicate a really good GPS fix. My value of 1.6 is, I don't know, not as good as it could be. Maybe if I took it out there, it would get better. I don't know, let's see. Oh God, it's even worse, 2.0. Look, how bad is that? Here, like a value of 1 or below gives you an accuracy of about 2.5 meters. So then presumably an HDOP of 2.0 is an accuracy of about 5 meters, which isn't that good. Don't know why my HDOP isn't better, even though I have 15 sats locked. But there you go. Now you know. At this point, you have got Betaflight GPS Rescue just about as reliable as it can be. But there are some gotchas, and I'm going to remind you not to forget them as you go forward. Don't just think, I got that Betaflight GPS Rescue thing solved, and go fly your quadcopter and never think about it again. Each time you take off, make sure that before you take off, you have plenty of sats locked, that you have a low HDOP, and after you take off, fly straight in a given direction for a little while and see that the home arrow points mostly in the correct direction. If you have a compass, which we haven't touched on at all because a lot of times Betaflight GPS Rescue doesn't actually benefit from a compass, especially on very small quadcopters. But if you do have a compass, make sure that the compass is oriented correctly. I've got a separate video where I did that. The video is in iNav, not in Betaflight, but the process of figuring out if the compass is oriented correctly is the same, and figuring out what values to put in there. So I'm going to link that down in the video description below. Also, if you have a compass, make sure that you have done a good compass calibration well away from any metallic or magnetic objects. But mostly in Betaflight, most people are just not going to use a compass and not really know the difference. If you're about to do a really critical flight, maybe do a test fly where you manually activate GPS Rescue or Failsafe before you just commit and full send it into the ocean. Just make sure that everything is good. In fact, you probably should be testing GPS Rescue fairly regularly to make sure that your GPS hasn't become damaged, that your auto level, that your angle mode, your accelerometer, that's the word, hasn't gone out of calibration. They can go out of calibration. Just test every little, once a day when you fly to make sure that it's all working right, to know that you can still rely on it. And there are a few edge cases where, for example, if you're flying in a super windy environment, the default Betaflight settings may not be able to get you to fight the wind and come home. Again, you should refer to that page linked in the video description for instructions on how to configure some of those parameters to deal with some of those cases. The final thing I got to say to you is, if your GPS has really poor performance, like it just is kind of like all over the place, there are some edge cases that can cause that as well, and you should look at that page to figure those out. But this video is already long enough. We're not going to dive into those. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this video about Betaflight 4.5 GPS Rescue, but that is not the only thing that Betaflight 4.5 is bringing to the party. There are a ton of new features and bug fixes and changes, and I'm going to be going through them. There's a playlist on screen right now, as well as linked down in the video description. The first thing you could do is go check out the first video in that playlist, which is my Betaflight 4.5 release overview, and see what's coming up. I'll put a link to that and a card on screen as well if you want to go straight there. I'll see you there.